Hi guys, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So a number of times underneath videos where I've posted things about antique swords like these behind me, people have quite understandably asked me where I get my antique swords. I kind of shy away from answering this question because, and this is a kind of apology I suppose, I've been collecting swords since I was about 16, 17 years old. I'm currently 38, in case any of you are wondering, so that's, you can do the maths. 20 years, just over 20 years. And I've, over that period of time, I've gone through lots of different venues, should we say, of, ways of getting antique swords. By and large, there are, I suppose, thinking about it, there are essentially three main ways. No, that's actually four main ways of getting your hands on antique swords. And one thing I should say at the beginning is they're not as expensive as you might think they're going to be. So you can, in UK money, obviously you can translate this into dollars or yen or whatever currency you use. You can pretty much get halfway decent antique swords in the UK from about £100 upwards. And if you're lucky, sometimes under £100. But generally speaking, most sort of 19th century Victorian kind of period swords in the UK cost usually between £200 and £600. That's the kind of price range that you're looking at. The ones that I've got on the wall behind me, a lot of them are quite unusual or quite rare, or they're very good condition or whatever. So generally speaking, my I would say my kind of top, my preferred, my best antique swords, that I've probably got about 20 of them, and they kind of take turns at being on the wall, and I have others of them behind the camera which you guys can't see. But obviously some of those are worth more money than that, but generally speaking you can start collecting 19th century swords if that's what you want, and that's pretty much the most affordable place to start, and that's why I started with 19th century swords. You can start collecting them for about £100–150 in the UK. I do understand that in some countries antiques are more expensive, or in some countries they're cheaper to buy. For example, in some parts of continental Europe I've seen antique swords for for £50. Or the equivalent of £50. Whereas I know that generally speaking, I think in America antique swords are a little bit more expensive, generally speaking, because there's less of them. In the UK, because of, obviously we've had a long history, but also we've kind of not had invading nations come through our country in the last 100 or 200 years, in fact, for a lot longer than that. But the point is, we haven't had two world wars actually on our turf, as it were. So British soldiers have been fighting in continental Europe in World War I and World War II, and they've brought souvenirs back with them. So I would say there are less, on average, there are less antique swords in France, for example, because obviously the Germans came through, and the British and the Americans and the Australians and the Canadians and other nations went to France, and a lot of them took souvenirs back with them. So it's an unusual feature that you'd find lots of antique French bayonets in Britain, and this is something that's always amused me. Why do you find so many French bayonets in Britain? And the only reasonable answer I can come to is that lots of them were brought back as souvenirs in World War I and World War II. Anyway, so basically, going back to my point, so where do I get antique swords from? Essentially it breaks down into antique auctions, antique shops, collectors' fairs, that is specialist arms and armour, antique arms and armour collectors' fairs, and online dealers. Those are, let's think about this, auctions, specialist collectors' fairs, antique shop, generalist antique shops that happen to have antique swords, and specialist dealers. These days, most of whom of course have websites. Back when I started collecting, the websites were just starting, but very few antique dealers had websites back in the 1990s. So there we go, those are the four main places. I'm not going to name specific places, and this is where the apology comes in, because I've spent 20 years kind of finding out the best places to lay my hands on antique swords, and the very simple fact is there are only a finite number of antique swords in the world. They're not being created, they're not being mass produced. There's a finite number, and the more collectors there are, the less swords there are per person. And as you can see, I like to collect quite a lot of them and get my hands on them. So in a brutally honest kind of way, anybody out there who's also collecting antique swords could be my competition in trying to get my hands on, get our hands on a specific antique sword. So if we're bidding an auction, we'll be bidding against each other. So that's the reason why I don't, generally speaking, answer with specific examples of where I get antique swords from, because I don't necessarily want to give away my sources. And I should point out, I do buy and sell some antique swords for my collection through my own website, which is antique-swords.co.uk. I'll put a link underneath this video. There we go. Essentially, if you want to get into antique sword buying, Victorian period swords, obviously they don't have to be British, could be American, French, German, whatever. They are pretty much the most affordable because they're the most numerous. There are lots of 19th century swords on the market out there to buy right now, from about £100 upwards and sometimes under £100. And the places you want to look are antique auctions. eBay as well. I just mentioned a thing about eBay. So the reason I didn't mention eBay is because a few years ago, stupidly, eBay UK decided to block the purchase, not the selling, but the purchase of swords and bladed weapons in the UK, which is utterly ridiculous because we can buy bladed items from anywhere else. But anyway, I won't get into the politics of that. But that's why I didn't list eBay. You can find antique swords on eBay, you can find good antique swords on eBay, but, and this goes for whether you're buying from an antique auction or from a dealer or anywhere else, the buyer beware always goes. So you basically, in the world of antiques, you need to know what you're buying. And yes, there's lots of fakes out there, there's lots of crap, there's lots of stuff which is wrongly described. And the more you know, the more likely it is that you will avoid buying crap, but equally you will be able to get a bargain. And you know, many of the swords I've got are worth a lot more than I paid for them because I've learnt a lot about the subject over 20 years, and when I see something that's misdescribed and priced below what it should be, I snap it up as quickly as I can, and that comes from knowledge. So read lots of books and get the knowledge. If you want to buy an antique sword right now, but you don't have the time to invest in being 100% sure that you have all the knowledge to go out hunting through auctions and stuff, then buy from a reputable dealer. A reputable dealer will sell you an authentic sword, they won't sell you a fake, and if you find anything wrong with it, they will either give you a refund and take the sword back, or work out some deal with you. So there we go, guys. I hope that's useful, and I hope that also explains why I don't always directly answer the question of where do I get my swords from. But happy hunting, and I'm happy to encourage anybody getting into the field of antique collecting, because it's very rewarding, and it also makes financial good sense, because generally speaking, if you buy good antiques, they only go up in value, and they tend to go up in value at a higher rate than putting your money in the bank will. There we go, a bit of financial advice as well from Schola Gladiatoria. Cheers, guys!